First and foremost, we're incredibly grateful to all of you that are joining us for this afternoon session, where we will be discussing best practices, learnings, and strategies for decoding climate reporting and reduction, in particular for professional service companies. However, we understand that there are individuals from a broad representation of industries joining today. And so even though the particular focus will be on professional services companies, there is a tremendous amount that we'll be sharing that we know is broadly applicable across multiple industries. In terms of today's agenda, we're going to cover a couple different topics. First one, just broad introductions on Sam and myself. I'm Adam Braun, co-founder and CEO at Climate Club. We'll also be diving into first a bit of a deep dive on climate reporting and disclosures that Sam will be leading a presentation on. Then I'll take some focus on best practices related to decarbonization. And then we'll close with an opportunity to address specific Q&A that you can enter into the Q&A box throughout the duration of today's talk. So at any point in time that a question surfaces, please feel free to drop that into the Q&A, and we'll make sure that we address as many questions as we can, either throughout the talk or at the closure of today's session. With that said, Sam, I'll turn it over to you for your introduction.
Yeah, thanks. So my name is Sam Stark. I'm a co-founder and CEO of Green Project Technologies. We're carbon accounting software really focused on service companies and the supply chains. By quick background, I used to work at Goldman Sachs in their sustainable finance department and was really looking at their scope 3 emissions, which included the emissions of their suppliers, vendors, kind of all the companies that we were working with that were not just Goldman's emissions, but the emissions of kind of the companies in our supply chain. And that included law firms, it included consulting firms, it included really the 1,000+ companies that we collaborated with, and really realized that there was a need for something more accessible, more focused for kind of service companies and supply chain companies who didn't have the same budget and same resources as a Fortune 2000 company. And that's really kind of where we're focused on at Green Project, and excited to kind of walk through it all today.
Fantastic. So I'm Adam Braun, co-founder and CEO at Climate Club. Climate Club is really focused on sustainability, intelligence, and planning, and really using those tools to drive decarbonization at companies across a broad spectrum of industries, but with a particular deep focus that is becoming more and more clear on this professional services space. By way of background, I've been an entrepreneur most of my career. I did start formally working at Bain & Company, and I built a large global education organization called Pencils of Promise that has built about 600 schools around the world, serving about 230,000 students a day. Also built an ed tech company that was acquired in 2018. And around 2019, I really started to focus on sustainability, have led a variety of quite large initiatives in multiple global contexts, and have the good fortune of being CEO at Climate Club with a bunch of incredible colleagues working with great companies today. In terms of a little bit about why Sam and myself and broadly both of the great teams that we work with wanted to put together today's session, one of the things to note is that between our two companies, which have a really fantastic partnership, and you'll hear a little bit about that today, we collectively work with several hundred companies now that represent nearly $1 trillion in market cap. You can see some of the great logos that we have the opportunity to work with and are engaging with, really on a very frequent, if not daily, weekly, or otherwise basis. And we've heard a consistent series of both questions, but more importantly, best practices surfaced throughout the duration of our conversations with the colleagues that we work with at many of these leading companies. And we felt that today's webinar would be a great opportunity to really focus some of the particular learning, best practices, and implementation strategies, again, really cater to professional services. So with that said, I'll turn it over to Sam, who's going to share his screen and walk you through the front half of today's presentation.
Perfect. Thanks, Adam. So let me just, there we go. So really, as I mentioned, our mission, we're focused on delivering climate transparency for service companies and supply chain companies. Green Project is a carbon accounting software There's a lot of carbon accounting softwares out there, and really our focus is to work through what is the scope 3 emissions for a lot of the large corporates out there, but is your own, obviously, scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, which is the supply chain emissions, which tends to be and cover a lot of service companies who have really been trying to figure out how can we make an impact and also track and report this data. And, as I was mentioning, the service companies, your emissions are part of your client's scope 3 footprint. And with new regulations coming out, you have CSRD obviously being passed in Europe. The SEC seems to be, although delaying, will be passing some sort of ruling, and pretty much all of the current regulations and proposed regulations include scope 3 emissions. And so companies who are in the supply chains of larger corporates, it's not just a decision around climate combating climate change, but it's also a business decision that they are going to start needing to tracking their emissions because their clients are going to start forcing them to. And we're seeing this on a daily basis. Larger corporates are now putting out surveys. They're preferring vendors over other vendors who are tracking their emissions, reporting their emissions, and eventually having a decarbonization pathway. And that's becoming really, really the kind of focal point right now. Is the scope 3 question. And not only that, but also SEC and other ruling bodies have said, if you've made a commitment as a really large corporate, you actually have to back that up. You can't just make these large commitments and not actually track and report your progress towards those commitments. And so now, if a large corporate has made a true net zero commitment, and that includes their suppliers and vendors are also going to have to align with those climate commitments. So there's kind of going to be a lot of pressures moving kind of downstream, especially in 2024, 2025, that are going to be affecting a lot of companies in the service realm and in the supply chain realm. And we're actually seeing this day to day. This is just an example of actually in the contracts of some companies, they're actually putting it in that you actually, to be a vendor, you have to attest to these different rules and regulations. But the question I get a lot, because we work with a lot of service companies and a lot of supply chain companies, is what reporting frameworks should I kind of use? What should I report to? There is so many different acronyms of people call it the alphabet soup of reporting, because there's just so many different things that are out there. What should I actually be focusing on? And there's a lot of frameworks. I mentioned a few of them here, and obviously you have TCFD now becoming part of the ISSB framework. But one thing that is becoming very clear for supply chain companies is there's two that they're getting a lot of requests on. And the two big ones is CDP and EcoVadis. If you're a supplier on this call right now, or a service company, you might have gotten these requests. These are becoming two of the leading places for companies to disclose emissions if you're within the supply chain. There's been over 50,000 suppliers being requested this information between these two platforms, and they're becoming increasingly kind of the backbone for disclosure of supply chain emissions. They are only one component in a much larger frameworks that large public companies are disclosing to, and there's obviously other frameworks we can discuss later on that you could also disclose to, but I do see again and again these frameworks coming up. And one thing that underpins both of them for companies to report on is their greenhouse gas emissions, scope 1, 2, and usually scope 3 emissions as well. At least upstream scope 3 emissions is becoming kind of what the kind of core quantitative metrics that you need to track and report on to report to these frameworks and to satisfy your clients' kind of questionnaires. There's other questions that come up. There's climate risk questions. There's what are you doing to reduce emissions? All of these kind of other supplemental questions. But the kind of backbone is the greenhouse gas protocol, which people compare it to the carbon accounting equivalent to GAAP for financial accounting. It really is that underpinning of how to actually track emissions, and then you can go from there of how do we actually approve upon and reduce emissions. And what Green Project has done is really make tracking scope 1 through 3 emissions much easier, much more accessible, and much more audit ready for companies. We want you to be able to spend as little time as possible on having to do all the data collection, on having to calculate your scope 1 through 3 emissions, so you can focus on what Adam will talk about, which is the actual reduction. Because if you're spending all your time just trying to gather all these pieces of data and you don't have enough time to actually focus on the reduction side, then it's not going to actually be as value additive, and obviously defeats the purpose in the end. And I'm just going to show very quickly, I'm not going to walk through a whole demo, but kind of what we are looking at really focusing on helping with at Green Project. And really what that is making this process really streamlined, an easy, accessible dashboard. We have integrations with 20,000 or 12,000 utility providers, a lot of the leading accounting softwares and ERP systems and travel softwares. And so we want the process for you as a company to not only be really simple of integrating data from different places, so you don't have to spend hours of gathering utility bills, which we hear from companies all the time, but also it creates a nice system of record for audit trails and reporting purposes as that becomes more of the focus, because a lot of places are now not only needing to report emissions, but also get a third-party assurance on their reporting. And we not only kind of provide the ways for collection of data and reporting of data, but we also provide really streamlined ways of tracking kind of a full trail of all your reports. And that's become an increasing focus today. So I won't touch on this too long on the dashboard, obviously can showcase it another time. But the thing I want to highlight is that we've tried to make this as efficient as possible for you, so you can spend less time really focusing on the hours that it can take for, and we hear it is not only hours, weeks and months of gathering data. And now I'll kind of turn it over to Adam. The last thing I'll say is what we've increasingly found is a lot of places going, what now, once they have their missions? And we can set targets in the dashboard, but increasingly it's how do we actually reduce our emissions? We have significant sources, and places don't just want to do offsets or renewable energy credits or these different environmental products. Those are a component, but to align with science-based targets and these different things, you need true real reduction. And this is what Climate Club can actually help with.
Great. Thank you so much, Sam. So let me jump back in and share my screen again here. When it comes to the two different solutions that you're going to hear a little bit about across the course of our time together today, it's really important to remain kind of focused on the commitment that we collectively have between Green Project and Climate Club to provide a shared solution to the marketplace that really enables companies to focus on the critical elements of carbon management. And so we view this as two essential components that support two complementary goals. When it comes to carbon accounting, it's ultimately really focused on accurate data collection, emissions calculations, and auditable processes for reporting. This is really, really critical, especially as we see the emergence of frameworks aligned to CSRD in Europe, some of what Sam touched on that's coming forward in the US. When the SEC regulations come out, likely in the next 12 months or so, and ensuring that companies can meet this threshold of audit and assurance. When it comes to this now what question, once companies understand their baseline, set their targets, and then this question surfaces of how do we actually achieve those targets, this is where Climate Club is really focused. And so within our scope of capabilities and services and software that we provide to companies, it incorporates one, foundational data enrichment, and this is really in complement to that foundation of data that Sam and Green Project is able to collect for companies. But it's also inclusive of the business context. And it's really important to call out that analyzing to understand where opportunities exist, and then using the data to create a plan that can be modeled out across every relevant scenario, which enables the setting of trackable targets, which we'll talk about shortly, and then reporting to the relevant stakeholders in real time so that they can make business decisions that progress towards company goals is a really critical set of capabilities that we're hearing increasingly frequently that companies really need in order to drive towards their targets. And so although the goals of carbon accounting and decarbonization on the surface might seem a little bit different, and as a result, they oftentimes require different tools and data, the reality is that when they're implemented in a coordinated fashion, there are tremendous efficiencies to be gained that I'll be talking about over the next couple slides. So from the lens of best practices that we have seen leading companies demonstrate, I think it's important to call out a couple data points. One in particular is that Accenture shared a broad study that came out late in 22 that shared that 93% of companies are off track to hit their decarbonization targets. Now that creates tremendous brand risk, it creates tremendous potential regulatory risk, business operational risk, and ultimately, when we think about the importance of sustainability to talent attraction, retention, and some of the business impact of these sustainability-driven goals, the question becomes, well, what are the 7% doing right? If 93% are off track, what are the 7% doing with tremendous efficiency and efficacy? And that's really what I wanted to focus on in my talk today, which is what are these best practices that companies are demonstrating that we are seeing time and time again with many of the companies that we work with. So there'll be a dedicated slide on each of these, but the first one is recognizing, in particular, professional service companies. It all starts with ensuring that you're delivering value to clients. And so the first place is to really ensure that you are continuing to prioritize client impact as well as internal readiness, recognizing that your most important and valuable asset is ultimately your people. The second step is they oftentimes start with what I would think of as low effort but high impact initiatives, and we'll talk through what some of those look like shortly. The third, at first may sound a little bit counterintuitive because the obvious step that many companies take is to focus on setting policies. However, what we've seen in the data very clearly demonstrates is policy setting is actually a terrible indicator of success when it comes to achievement of decarbonization goals. It's actually really critical to set targets first and then use those targets to drive policy, which we'll talk about shortly. And then the final component is to ensure that you are measuring and monitoring everything in real time because of many of the significant business implications that result from the pathway towards the achievement of your strategy. So starting with this focus on prioritizing client impact and internal readiness, it's really, really important to use data to understand both internal and external readiness and to communicate a rollout strategy that maximizes impact, adoption, and engagement, both for your clients and your people. Starting with client impact, in the professional services space, at the end of the day, it is absolutely critical to consistently enhance that trusted advisor status, whether you're a consulting firm, a law firm, an agency of some kind. What we're seeing is there's an increasing opportunity that companies are actually building out ESG or sustainability-driven practices to support client ambitions. And then the third part that's really important to note is as you look at the foundational carbon accounting that Sam and Green Project can deliver, you have to recognize that you as a service provider are now part of your clients' scope 3 emissions. And so as they set their own decarbonization goals, as Sam touched on, and we've certainly seen this with some of the companies that we work with today, you're being asked as part of supplier onboarding to commit not only to measure your emissions, to submit to CDP and EcoVadis, but oftentimes to commit to things like the Science Based Targets Initiative that focuses on your decarbonization journey. And so this is becoming really critical to win clients, to retain clients, and to deliver long-term value. And then as you look at the internal readiness, we know that 95% of employees expect their employers to become more sustainable in the future. And so there's a really critical need in the war for great talent and to retain your talent to actually walk the walk, not just talk the talk on your sustainability journey. And that incorporates oftentimes something that we deliver for many companies, which is foundational upskilling related to sustainability, not just broad sustainability, but sustainability in your seat, how this relates to an individual in legal, in HR, in finance, in procurement, et cetera. And then to actually empower your business decision makers to drive the sustainability agenda, both internally and then equally of importance for your clients. And then finally, to incorporate your sustainability targets into performance management. And so we see this at many leading companies today, including some of those that we work with. We've seen it broadly in the market with AstraZeneca, MasterCard, a Mars company, many others, where they're either starting by tying executive performance management and compensation in part to the achievement of ESG or sustainability goals, but the most ambitious companies are actually tying this down to a small part of all employee compensation, which ultimately drives action. If we continue on to really look at the high visibility initiatives that are, past these first buckets that I touched on in the internal readiness and client value buckets. If we move into these two really, really visible high impact areas, we'd start with business travel. And when it comes to business travel, for many professional service companies, as Sam and the good folks that are putting together foundational carbon accounting will share, this is oftentimes a very material part of the totality of a company's emissions. Within business travel, there are very clear pathways that companies can utilize software and services to actually what we refer to as reduce business travel without reducing business. Because oftentimes what we'll hear is, I need to be with clients. And in a post-COVID world, many companies are trying to figure out what that new normal looks like. And rather than setting these kind of broad blanket policies, what we really not only see in the market from leaders, but what we encourage and oftentimes work with companies to deliver is the capabilities that enable the composition, the unification of data that helps companies surface, one, what is the purpose of a trip? Two, what is the return on investment of that trip? Three, it's really important to note that who is paying for a trip, the data shows drives an understanding of implied value. So we've seen research from the firm T. Clara that says that actually 24% of all business trips broadly from their surveying capabilities prove out are defined as low value. And that's by the individual who is taking the trip. And so most of these trips, it turns out, can actually be predicted before they are taking using pre-trip assessments, data, insights, and analytics. And it's really important that each company, as you drive on your journey to decarbonization, as well as scaling your actual business targets, reallocate travel costs from low value trips to moderate to high value trips without really substantially changing your travel budget allocations. And there's an expected value increase of about 26% by taking these activities. And so understanding who pays for a trip becomes relevant because the data shows that when clients are paying for travel, there's oftentimes more low value travel occurring. And so at Climate Club, we often enable companies to create a holistic trip score, which attributes value and enables companies to understand what is the kind of perceived health of the totality of travel, and then where are the opportunities to drive reductions. On the commuting and home energy side, also part of a company's Scope 3 emissions, what we see is it's really important in today's market and landscape to recognize that commuting has executive level visibility right now as organizations manage culture and their return to work policies. And so companies that are leading are marrying these efforts to their strategic goals, understanding the current situation of employees and investing in decarbonization levers, which align to the executive and company priorities and contribute to driving employee engagement and retention. And in order to succeed in these areas, it's really critical that companies have the ability, which we deliver in complement to our partnership with Green Project, to gather activity-based, not only data, but insights. So moving from broad estimates to real concrete activity-based information, and then using that to drive the employee activation and retention, as well as reducing the risks that oftentimes come with some of these policies that can be rolled out without taking into account and incorporating data collected up front. If we move into this third set of capabilities around target setting. So it's important to acknowledge that within the target setting capabilities, there are really important components. And I'm showing a slide here that's about measuring and monitoring everything. But within the actual target setting, what we often find is that for many companies that start with policies, there are three deficiencies with policies. The first is that policies are incredibly broad-based, and they are often deployed in a one-size-fits-all approach. The second deficiency is that it is not really catered to an individual team. It is oftentimes top-down, and therefore people don't feel like their voices are often heard. And the third is, as I touched on before, the actual data shows that broad rolled out policies are quite ineffective. In fact, they are a really, really poor indicator of sustainability driven success. On the other side, when it comes to actually driving the targets, targets are much more effective to start instead of policies, because first and foremost, they are ultimately customized. And in particular with some of the capabilities that I'll share on this slide and subsequent slides, targets enable companies to build out bespoke, customized understanding of where your employees, teams, and functions are at in their journey, and then meet them with a specific set of targets that are most relevant. The second piece is that it really should be delivered by management rather than at the very top of the company where it is kind of rolled out from a board or a CEO. And this way, employees and teams really feel heard, incorporated, and understand what they are driving to. And the third and really important piece is by defining a target for a group of individuals to work towards, and then seeing their progress on a real-time basis towards that target, you collect a tremendous amount of data, and then you can use that data to inform custom policies rather than a one-size-fits-all. And so as companies roll out these policies, it's really critical to then move into this fourth best practice around measuring and monitoring everything. So this is a screenshot from the Climate Club platform that surfaces the ability for companies to really align where decisions and expectations meet within an organization by understanding real-time performance. As you can see, you can actually visualize in a quite easy dashboard that can be surfaced across not just the senior leadership or the head of, let's say in this case, some of the screen shares that I'll provide are related to air travel, the travel management team and the sustainability team, but also, let's say, the GM of a region that is actually responsible for achieving that target. And so as you move from just some of the capabilities, there's our target slide, but let me just jump ahead. If we go into the further capabilities on measuring and monitoring everything, you start to visualize the capabilities to actually report and surface back to employees and team leaders their value of trip. And again, this becomes really, really important, recognizing the significance of differentiating between low value, moderate value, and high value trips as you start to toggle where you are driving emissions versus where you are driving value and spend. But where this then ties back into some of the target setting that I was describing is the need to actually build out the goals and the targets and the aspirations on a team by team basis. So you can see this now on the right-hand side of this slide. This is illustrative, but for some of the companies and clients that we work with, it's really critical for them to not only understand how are we doing against a very concrete emissions target, but what is the expenditures that are going into this? How are we doing against a goal on an emission by emission trip based perspective? And also, what is the value? In this case, you can see for a sales organization, what is the value? And again, thinking about client value in the professional services context that is being demonstrated by this travel, and then really building thoughtful and effective policies by delivering these targets first. The final component of the screenshots that I'll share from the Climate Club platform is what we think of as the drill down all the way into specific teams. And we see this really, really prominently in our professional service clients, where teams often come together, let's say in a consulting or a legal basis, in a short-term project-based model. And when you come together in that short-term project-based model, it's really important to have the capability to start to look at, okay, how do we toggle between increased emissions versus increased value versus increased spend? And this drill down, which you see here is a heat map for an individual team, really starts to surface. One, you can get clarity on the performance of your emissions on not only an individual basis, but also start to look at internal versus external trips, business versus economy class, indirect versus non-indirect flights, and perceived high value versus perceived low value trips. And that really enables the automation of reporting, data collected in real time in an actionable way for business decision making, and also is incredibly helpful to really quantify the ROI for both internal and client-facing opportunities. So in closing, what we see is that for leading companies today on their decarbonization journey, there's really 3 steps to achieving excellence. This first getting started step is really oriented around 3 core components. The first is understanding client and internal readiness, collecting the data to generate the baselines. Oftentimes this is done by a green project or similar, but obviously we're big proponents of Sam and his company and his platform. And then using that data to really identify the first set of early wins that you can celebrate and generate opportunities around. The second step is really aligning these processes with your culture. And we know that people are hungry for the incorporation of this element of a company, but they want it done in a thoughtful way that doesn't sacrifice business outcomes. And so what's really important there is to start by modeling the scenarios before you roll them out to understand the expected impact, both on sustainability and costs. And what we see in many cases is for most companies, decarbonization of, in particular, business travel and commuting actually leads to very, very material cost savings. So this is a win-win, something that CFOs in particular love. You also have to set targets for your early adopters. Oftentimes this might be those that are perhaps traveling the most, those that are generating the most emissions, but also those that oftentimes around sales teams, they're creating the most value. And so you really have to make sure that you are incorporating them throughout the process, which is something that we do really closely with our clients. And then, providing the real-time insights early on in that journey so that people can really track towards the intended goals. And then finally, as you start to deploy these initiatives at scale, continue to measure, monitor, and empower your people on a real-time basis. Celebrate wins that highlight impact. We've seen many companies do a fantastic job, and I know Sam and I both have probably strong perspectives on some of the best practices and ways that some of our clients are doing this. And then finally, automation of reporting. This historically was a very manual process. Software and companies like Green Project and Climate Club have built the partnership that we built to really streamline and automate that process for many, many companies. And so this should enable a quite streamlined experience for anybody that takes on either one or perhaps the joint solution that we've developed together. And that these efforts we recognize are substantial, but they must be done together, ideally as part of a single strategic initiative. And Green Project and Climate Club are here to help you do just that. So we'll open it up to Q&A. Before taking some questions, I'll leave this slide up, but one thing just to recognize is that as Sam and I and our teams were connecting in advance, really planning out this webinar in particular, one thing that was important to us was to find a way to ensure that there was sustained value beyond just the content that we're sharing today. And so we wanted to offer for those that are either attending live or those that will watch this recording at a later date, the opportunity to get a free joint materiality assessment from our 2 companies together. You can just send a quick email to hi@climateclub.com. It'll go to both of our teams and we'll follow up. It's a very short questionnaire, shouldn't be too time consuming, but we are uniquely offering for this group to do a joint materiality assessment that will help you identify the most critical issues where you are on that journey and some of the actionable strategies and learnings and steps that you can take as part of your journey going forward.
Amazing. Well, thank you, Adam. I see some questions popping up in chat, and I think maybe a bunch of them seem to. I think certain ones may be better for you to answer, certain ones better for me to answer. So maybe I can start. I think the first one we had is, how does Green Project enable CDP or EcoVadis reporting? I think maybe I can take that one first. So Green Project does kind of two parts to it. One is we have the ability to calculate your scope 1 through 3 emissions, which is a significant component for CDP reporting and the climate part of EcoVadis reporting. And we can do that in a very streamlined and auditable and clean way. But in addition to that, we also have preset questionnaires within the dashboard, so we can actually help you fill out additional questions for CDP around risk management or around different climate policies that your business has, and actually preset that into a report that you can submit directly into the reporting frameworks. On top of that, we have a sustainability manager that walks your company through the whole process. What we've found is just giving a company a software and saying, run with this is never, quite enough. They need kind of the human element with the software. And so the sustainability managers from the Green Project side, who are all trained on carbon accounting and climate reporting, will actually walk you through the process of what you need to have to report to these, when the deadlines are, kind of all of the different things that you might need or have questions around. We will actually have that kind of human element paired with the software element. Maybe for Adam, I see one that says, what are some easy, I guess this one you did say this already, but what are some examples of easy reduction exercises for professional service companies?
Sure. So I think professional service companies are really uniquely positioned in the broad landscape of holistic industries to drive quick, efficient. Nothing is ever fully easy, but depending on the company, the speed at which things can be implemented varies quite broadly. And for professional service companies, uniquely, because they don't have this big physical supply chain that might require the turnover of a historical manufacturing plant, or changing of how you are shipping huge infrastructure. What I tried to touch on was two of the areas that are most substantive in terms of emissions generation, but also really within a 6 to 12 month period, sometimes perhaps even sooner, companies can actually make really material progress on. And I certainly would encourage companies, and it's what we've seen from the leaders, to really start, if you're in the professional services space, with a materiality assessment, as I touched on, and we are uniquely offering so that we can help companies on that journey. So again, anyone that just wants to send the email to hi@climateclub.com, we can help you uniquely identify what those components are, recognizing it's nuanced for each company. But broadly, I think one is certainly in air travel. The other would be, or broadly business travel, but air travel usually makes up the lion's share of emissions. For some companies, though, it could be more around hotel. Rail is usually quite efficient. Ground transportation is usually not a huge piece of the pie. But I would say broadly business travel, and then this combination of employee commuting, which is now incorporating home energy for hybrid or work from home companies. Those tend to be two ones that are very, very doable. But they require the right tools. They require the right capabilities. That's why we built out what we built at Climate Club, and why we've built out our great partnership with Green Project. The other one that I just want to acknowledge is, for many companies, this employee education and upskilling in professional services is really critical, not just because it helps the company on their own decarbonization journey, but it positions them for success with clients. I remember seeing a data point that said that the majority of millennials are leaving their financial advisors because they don't believe that they understand their ESG related priorities very well. And so it's important, as you think about the generational transfer that is happening and will happen ahead, to recognize the attitudes, the preferences, and the priorities of both, in particular, Gen Z, but certainly millennials as well. And even the data is showing Gen X, baby boomers, and beyond. This is no longer a massive debate about whether climate change is happening. People acknowledge it is happening. And as both you and I have experienced, Sam, our companies that we're working with, they are asking for us to provide this data and actually demonstrate improvement year on year. And so it's really important to upskill and help employees understand how they can better serve clients as well. Those would be the three that I would encourage.
It's as much as an employee engagement tool or benefit in some ways as I've seen with as it can be a tool for them reporting to their clients. And I would say on the harder side of things, you can one of the things Green Project offers is supply chain engagement. And so although you're being engaged as part of somebody else's supply chain, we can also engage your suppliers and vendors and help you to help set targets across them. And obviously that's for companies who are kind of more down the line and sophisticated in this process, but it is a really big decarbonization area as well for service companies, because purchase goods and services still makes up a big chunk as well.
Yeah.
The next question, maybe. Oh, sorry.
No, I feel like I took the last one, so I'll pose one to you.
Oh, yeah.
So, one question here from Wendy is, you mentioned new SEC regulations. Can you expand on what you anticipate these will be?
Yeah, I mean, what the SEC regulations seem to be following TCFD's recommendations, which also seem to align with what you're seeing in what's going on in Europe, although Europe is taking this double materiality standard. And so what I would say at the bare minimum, almost everyone thinks scope 1 and 2 is going to be part of the SEC standard. So public companies will have to report their own scope 1 and 2 emissions. Scope 3 emissions, I think there's a decent chance increasingly, because Europe's already kind of paved this way, that the US will follow and include scope 3 emissions as it's currently written. But even if they don't, companies who have set climate commitments, the SEC has said, you will have to track and report your progress towards those commitments. So if you are a large corporate who's made a net zero supply chain commitment, which something like 50% of the Fortune 2000 companies have done, you are going to have to track and report your progress towards that commitment, even if the SEC themselves aren't saying every public company has to report scope 3 emissions. So I think, in terms of timing, the end of this year, we'll probably have something in writing. It might not include scope 3. That's the big question. But no matter what, if I still think the pressure is going to move downstream, both with CSRD in Europe and just with large corporates who have made these commitments that they have to fulfill. Let's see how professional. Sorry, I'm just reading. I guess I'll just answer one more because this just came in, and then I'll turn it back to you. It says, how are professional service companies approaching purchase goods and services accounting or organization accounting for the deliverables of the contract as purchase goods and services? The way I would say for this is much more, yes, if you're doing any work where you have some sort of, you're in the expenses of another company is spending money on you as a service company, you are now part of their scope 3 emissions, and will have some sort of attribution. There's a few ways to do attributions. Some will do it very specifically, and they'll look at exactly the flights and different products that were dedicated just towards them. But the more common way of places doing it is they attribute based on their amount of spend on you, divided by the total revenue that you've brought in a year. So it's essentially an attribution of their attributed emissions towards you. And you can do the same thing with your suppliers, whereas you look at, I have 1,500 suppliers, and I spend XYZ on each supplier. I'm going to attribute a certain amount of emissions based on what % of their revenue I make up. So there is the specific I'd say product or specific individual analysis that's even more granular, but most places are doing some sort of attribution factor to account for purchase goods and services.
Yeah, I think that's a great overview. And what we hear really consistently with most companies is purchase goods and services again, depending a little bit on industry, but regardless of what industry you're in, it is going to be a material part of the totality of your emissions. And this kind of touches into that that really thorny supply chain area that I think you all built a really fantastic solution around as well. So if I look at some of the additional questions that have been submitted, and for those that are on, feel free to continue to submit additional ones. We haven't got until the top of the hour. One of the questions here is, well, I'll take the decarbonization one, and then I think we can talk about the integration as well. So the question is, what have you seen as the primary internal driver among professional service organizations for formalizing ESG/decarbonization efforts? I'll share a perspective. Sam, feel free to chime in as well, as I know you probably hear a fair amount from the hundreds of organizations that you've worked with as well. I think in many cases the conversation certainly starts with leadership. Oftentimes that can incorporate CEO, CFO, COO. Oftentimes legal is involved because this can be seen as a contributor to potential company risk. And the interesting thing is sustainability in many organizations actually lives in different places. So for some organizations, it might live within ops. For others, it might live within legal. For others, it might report into finance. For others, it's in public affairs or communication or marketing. But broadly, I think the leading companies oftentimes will put together an ESG or sustainability cross-functional steering committee. It's a really important early step that companies take to ensure that there is collaborative visibility and buy-in across the multiple different functions that drive a company forward and are ultimately going to be responsible for the long-term decarbonization of a company's internal operations and its broader value chain. And the mistake that we see play out time and time again, in many cases when Climate Club starts working with a company, it's actually because of this issue, is that the CEO and the board says, we have to do something because we know the significance. We're getting all these different pressures from investors, from our employees, from our suppliers, from our partners, from our clients, that we have to get better on sustainability and we need to solve this soon. And they will either put in place for the first time, or they'll go to the individual that's already leading broadly ESG and sustainability, and they'll say, we need you to help us understand where we are today and set targets. And the C-level, the C-suite, and the board will work with the head of sustainability to define the baseline, set targets, oftentimes if it's best practice, aligned to the Science Based Targets Initiative, and then they will announce those publicly, and then they will roll that out to the company. And the miss here is that they don't usually incorporate the business functional leaders in that process, and those individuals are then hit with this expectation that they're going to be able to successfully decarbonize when this has not been part of their historical responsibilities. And that's where the software and services that we've built are really oftentimes quite valuable, and we hear it time and time again, to translate, to really build the bridge between how do sustainability targets live within the sustainability team into how do they live in the business in a way that doesn't actually impact, but it ideally is really an accelerant of business value creation. And that's our big focus, is how do we help companies achieve that? And so I would say the CFO is oftentimes a really important stakeholder here, because the long-term goal for every company really should be to develop the capabilities. And this is where this joint solution that we've developed together as companies can help companies, clients move towards. This question is, how do you ultimately manage your carbon or manage your emissions, much like you are able to manage your financials, such that you have a holistic sense, at the start and at the end of the year of what your targets are, but you're also able to measure, monitor, and improve performance and progress on a quarter by quarter, or a month by month, or a week by week basis.
Amazing. Yeah, I think that answered it pretty thoroughly. I'll maybe answer, and then we can end with about this last question about the integration. But I'll answer before that. What part should offsets or RECs play in decarbonization strategy? This is obviously a very kind of, I'd say, topical question, because there's been a lot of criticism about companies, quote unquote, buying their way out or purchasing offset projects that aren't actually reducing what they say they're reducing. What I will say is, first and foremost, it is always better to reduce before offsetting or any other sort of environmental products. That's that is kind of the first line of defense that is really important, and something like what Adam has shown, and being able to take actionable insights is most important. With that being said, I do think there is a place for offsets and other environmental products. What I would say with that is it's important of how you do it. We worked with a company called ACT Commodities, and one of the interesting things I really like about what their approach is they actually map different products that are much more closely aligned with the emission generating activities. So it could be for energy usage, it's RECs or GOOs in Europe. It could be certain renewable natural gas certificates for things for natural gas usage. It could be some sort of offset that's tailored much more to their activities as opposed to just some general offset project. And so making emissions reduction buying emission reduction projects, whether it's offsets or other environmental certificates that map more towards your emissions and align more to your emissions and have these additionality, quote unquote, factors to them, is super important. So first is obviously reducing as much as you can, but yeah, I'm not somebody who says, you never should offset or never should do this, because I do think there is a real role in it, but it is important to be strategic about it. And there are a few companies out there that I think, and I, feel free to follow up with us on this, that I think do a really good job of matching kind of much higher quality projects, much more relevant projects to your company's emission generating activities, and where there's actually a use for them. And that's where I would say I am cynical at certain cases of them, and in other cases think they're a huge tool that can really help in the effort. So yeah.
Right. I think that's a fantastic both perspective and actual pathway that Green Project can support companies on. In closing, final question here was how do your products integrate with one another? The fortunate thing is we're seeing an incredible amount of collaboration broadly in this sector. And we recognize that there is really no one size fits all tool because of the increasing emergence of new regulation, new requests, new needs. And instead, what we're seeing is the development of really effective partnerships where products can directly integrate with one another to ensure the appropriate and automated transfer of data that then populates value and insights for clients by having a connected set of products. And so this is something that if any of you want to set up a live demo of either one of our products or the two products together, you can see both Sam and my contact information at the bottom of the slide. You can go to either one of our websites, either greenprojecttech.com or climateclub.com. Both of us have the ability to set up a demo, and in the notes you can certainly put in the request to see how the integration between our two products works. Or if you want to just email hi@climateclub.com, we'll set up that free joint materiality assessment, and as part of that we can actually show you directly how some of the product integration works. But at a high level, this is all really intended to generate value, ease of experience, and speed for individuals like yourself that are leading the great organizations that are driving the way forward for the broader goals that we all have for planetary well-being, and also doing so in a way that accelerates and creates customer value for the companies that you all are serving.
Totally agree. And there seemed to be one last question that popped in here, unless we'll just answer it before we go. And it's, how did professional service companies think about science-based targets and net zero targets? Will reaching net zero require a reduction in contracts type or size over time? I'll give my, maybe Adam, you can jump in, but very quick on that. One thing you can do with net zero targets, if I'm understanding the question correctly, is you can do emissions intensity. So you don't have to just reduce. It's not always about absolute emissions reductions. You can actually reduce emissions per dollar revenue, per employee, per certain intensity unit. And so your company can still grow and you can still overall reduce your emissions on a per unit basis in alignment with SBTI or the science-based targets. And so I do think reaching net zero will require changes in your supply chain, potentially will require changes in other places' supply chains, and you're seeing this. And so there is going to be shifts in who you purchase from or who other companies purchase from, where there's priority. Essentially, there's some premium to companies who are aligning with the goals that another company has set forth. So I do think that will happen, but I don't think it's this worrisome thing where you can't grow or you can't get bigger as a company because of setting a climate reduction goal. You definitely can, and it can just be an intensity target.
Yeah, the thing I would just add in to that is that this is a collective societal effort, and this is where the scope 3 piece gets really compelling, because we are each a part of the companies that we interface with emissions in the way that the reporting and the disclosures and the decarbonization strategies are actually developed through these broader frameworks that everyone is adhering to. And so, my long-term belief is you're going to see each part of our society decarbonize. In the process of decarbonizing, each company as a supplier to the other part of another company's value chain, we shouldn't ideally have to actually reduce the size of contract or the size of value that we're generating for customers. We should just be able to do it in a more thoughtful way. And in order to achieve these goals, what will happen is the companies that are operating most sustainably will win the most business. And so it's just another value creation opportunity for companies that are committed to being at the forefront of their respective sector, and part of why we wanted to organize today's session. So again, thank you so much to all of you that have joined us. We are certainly accessible through either one of our company websites, and eager to progress the conversation ahead.